Hey guys, welcome to book review number 56. Today I'm going to be reviewing Hokkaido Highway Blues, Hitch-Hiking in Japan by Will Ferguson. I don't know if you guys can quite see that. Anyway, what this book is about is it's about Will Ferguson taking a road trip across Japan, or more accurately, from the southern end of Japan to the northern end of Japan by hitchhiking. Now this fits into a lot of the previous travel reviews that I've done, in that the author is kind of part of the storyline, but also it covers the history of Japan as well as the people, both sort of in his immediate circumstances as well as expanding upon the larger society at various points in the book. Well, anyway, he starts his journey on the Cape Sata on the island of Kyushu. Now, he actually doesn't start at the very tip of the island, but actually gets kind of close, and then it says, it's close enough, we'll call it, he heads north. I should say I'm going to cover kind of his journey through and then do some final analysis or what I think about the book at the end. So he starts on Cape Sata and sees his first hitchhiking family, and eventually heads north with some various people up to what's known as Monkey Island, which is where researchers in Japan have found monkeys that are actually able to kind of have more advanced communication with one another than previously thought possible by primates. I think it's like some sort of learned tactic for crossing from one island to another island. These islands not being very far apart, but just off the coast of Japan, but they're able to sort of interact in a way previously not thought. Then he heads up to Udo Shrine, which is a famous shrine in Japan to the Udo. Well, why don't you guys tell me? I think it's the some sort of sea god or the god of fishermen. And then he goes up to Miyazaki. And I actually found this the most interesting part of his travels through Kyushu. I should say not only in Kyushu, but through all of Japan. He kind of takes the back roads. Like, he doesn't see Nagasaki or Fukuoka on Kyushu. He doesn't see Tokyo or Osaka or even Hiroshima. He kind of chooses to, as much as possible, be kind of with small town Japan. And I don't think this is necessarily because of just sentimentality, but I think it's just because he thinks that he has a better opportunity to interact with people on a one-on-one basis. Whereas in like large cities, it's very easy to get lost in the gaijin quarter or not really kind of have a of the earth type of experience. Now that can make for an interesting book, but I think ultimately it's less, it gets less to the heart of Japan than if he really has to interact with people on a one-on-one basis. And I'll also talk about I'm kind of backtracking, I'll also talk about some of the people some after I review kind of where he's gone, and just kind of their thoughts and their sentimentalities and stuff. So anyway, he kind of heads north to Saiki, which is the kind of a sleepy ferry city between Kyushu and Shikoku, the Shikoku Island. And so he heads up there, and he sees, like there's a lot of mist, and he travels over in the middle of the night, and it's very kind of spooky. So anyway, he goes to Shikoku in the inland sea, Some of the things that were interesting when he was on Shikoku is he, I want to say Ono-Roshi or Ono-Roshi was a famous monk that helped develop Buddhism, and not really bring Buddhism to Japan, but kind of furthered the evolution of Buddhism in Japan, and was famous for not circumnavigating, walking around the perimeter of the island and setting up various temples, or various temples were later erected in areas where he had visited along the island of Shikoku. Other than that, I think the other part that I found really interesting was in Izakaki, Izaki, he found a museum, and he says he hates museums just because he thinks they're kind of staid and not real of the people, I guess you would say. They're kind of like museum pieces. They're in museums. And he's much more interested in the immediate anthropology of interacting with actual humans. But he did find a sex museum in Izakaki, and he's a pretty humorous writer. He talked about how at first it was kind of shocking, and he also talks about some of the temples and stuff that are associated with sex in Japan. Not necessarily this is where I want the book review to go, but I thought it was an interesting side note. And he at first it was kind of shocking when we went into this museum because there were just figurines and display maps of sexual stuff from all over the world, really. Some mostly taken from Japan, but also some international stuff. But he said by the time he got through the museum, he was just so deadened to the effect that such a museum would have that, it was just kind of like, whatever. And also it was funny because there were like old lady tourist groups that were going through here and, seeing this stuff and just taking it for what it is. He said that if he was with a family, he might be a little bit embarrassed, but whatever. Okay, so then he goes on to Matsuyama, and I got to work on my pronunciations here. Komatsu. And in this region, I just remember him talking about how, it's become very developed. He also talked about, and I forget what the specific name is, but it was a specific type of people that are kind of like the underclass of Japan, almost sort of like the untouchables in the class system of India. Now, you don't hear about a class system of Japan, but they say that, I think it starts with a B, like, I can't remember. I'd have to find the specific page. But he talks about how there was like this village on the north coast of Shikoku, which was one of the largest of these people's type village in the entire country, and how the caste system was less known than obviously in the West than the caste system is in like India. And although it's kind of largely, or at least somewhat disappeared, it's still in sort of the large corporate structure that a lot of people in Japan work in. The salaryman system is still kind of an unacknowledged thing. I mean, I guess if you really want to extend the metaphor like really far, you might say like black people in the United States, but it's just, it's they're both underclasses, but it's kind of comparing apples to oranges. But anyway, that does exist in Japan, a country that seemingly is very monotonous, particularly in ethnicity, but there is certain groups of people that are seen as lesser in society. And then he goes kind of on a long journey all the way up to Takamatsu. And I guess retracting a little bit, I talked about how Ono-Roshi, I think is how you pronounce it, circumnavigated Shikoku. What was I going to say? The long journey. Yeah, this goes well with the long journey that I was talking about, how he took across the northern coast of Shikoku. That traditionally it was viewed as a hardship or like a great achievement that this actually would happen. But now they have like tourist groups in air-conditioned buses with specific, very unique Japan-specific uniforms that all the people on the bus would all wear to signal that they're on the bus. And I think they called them like instant pilgrims or something. These people that thought that they were getting the same merit as Ono-Roshi was. I should really look that up to make sure I'm pronouncing it right. But anyway, the thinking that they were going to get the same, I don't care, the same merit as he was, but, you know, the author seriously questioned, as well as, you know, some of the more cynical members of the Japanese community, or particularly the population of Shikoku, who kind of had to do these things on an everyday basis, how legitimate this was. So anyway, he after that, he takes the ferry from Takamatsu up to Shodo Island, and what did he do on Shodo? Oh, he almost got on a seaplane, but the seaplane was actually broke. So that was kind of the big story from Shodo Island. He also saw there's a smaller circuit route of temples for, I'm saying it wrong, Ono-Roshi. He checked out some of those temples on the island too. He also felt that the temples on Shoto were kind of a little more interesting because they were. It's not as well known a circuit, and it's a little smaller, so they felt a little more isolated, a little more personal, rather than the kind of busload, almost tourist attraction type temples that they had on Shikoku. Okay, so next he goes across the inland sea, which he says is just a mess of ships and industrial whatever that he's interested in, but doesn't particularly want to dedicate this book towards. I mean, it has an interest in and of itself, but you know, there's only so much you can say about a warehouse. So next he goes up to Himeji, Himeji, which is the famous castle city in Japan. One of, I believe, 15 original surviving castles that haven't been rebuilt. Maybe it's 12 across the country, but probably, I would guess, the most famous original castle in Japan. He says it is spectacular. Oh man, I forgot to mention something. He says it is spectacular. It is as grand as you expect, and it's set in I think a vast garden with cherry trees. And this is what I forgot to actually mention, is that he was actually following the Suzuka? Oh no. He was actually following the cherry blossom festivals, the Hamani and the falling of the cherry blossoms, which is the, oh man, I should know this. All the way from the tip of Japan to all the way in the north in Hokkaido. And because the climates kind of vary or are delayed as you go north, he could do this all simultaneously. So it would take him X amount of time, and he could just kind of go up Japan, through the back roads of Japan, viewing these cherry blossoms, which bloom and fall very quickly. But because they bloom and fall kind of in a wave, if you will, he could follow that wave up the coast. Oh my gosh, that is embarrassing. Shisoku. Okay, well anyway, crossing over. Man, I should have marked that down. I feel embarrassed. Next he goes up to kind of central Honshu. And what he does is he quickly goes past all the urban development around Osaka and Kobe and even Kyoto, and heads up to the Sea of Japan, where he sees the Bridge of Heaven, which is famous for man, I'm losing my train of thought. It's famous as this kind of strip of sand that is one of the 3 viewing sites most famous sites in all of Japan, and is actually where I believe the Shinto religion has its mythical base or mythical starting point. And some of the gods of Shintoism came out of this area, and then the gods eventually bequeathed humans, and the humans, particularly the emperor, and then the emperor's line, but also the other members of Japan, other Japanese people. So it's kind of like where all of Japan started. Then he cuts back and goes through Obama. Okay, this book was actually written in '99, so they would not have any idea of what Obama was. And then Fukuki and Toyama, which he says he felt was just kind of this big, sprawling, overdeveloped city. Kurumbe. Let's see what else we got. Okay, and that's kind of central Japan. What he's talked about? He talked about, the cherry blossoms. He's also said that this part of the region was much more frigid than the rest of the, obviously Kyushu. That the Sea of Japan has a much more frigid base, as you would think, being next to Siberia than, the Pacific Ocean does. And then he went to Sado Island, where he met some of the more interesting things in the book happened on Sado. He talked about these breezy ski runners or ski instructors that drove him around some on some of his hitchhiking. And then he also talked about how they have these famous drums there that they beat really hard. They're famous Sado Japanese drums that create these really intense rhythms and really get you going. Yeah, so that was pretty interesting. Then he took a boat ride up to Nagita, another urban area, and with a bunch of drunkard Japanese. Yes, not all of them are super polite. Some of them are rough around the collar, believe it or not. Even though very little, well, I should say, okay, so the impression from Japanese that the West is riddled with crime is untrue. Obviously, the crime rates are much higher, but the fact that it happens just ubiquitously everywhere is untrue. Even in areas that are high crime areas, often crime isn't happening. It just seems that way because the statistics portray it that way. But also, if Japanese have a stereotype of the people in the West being ruffians, then the impression of a lot of Westerners that all Japanese are, these reserved, quiet, kind of very ephemeral type characters is not necessarily true. Now, there is very little crime in Japan, almost nil crime, really. But there are very kind of like drunker, ruffian, rough around the collar, blue collar type guys. And that was actually one of the joys of this book. I'm saying this specifically because he went on a mountain passage with some of these guys up in the Tohoku region, where it was still kind of snowy and the flower blossoms. Shikoku? Man, I'm not going to get Suzuka? I'm not going to get that before this review is over. Yeah, okay, so I lost my train of thought. So yeah, he went up with some of them into the mountains, and which was kind of, he said he didn't really feel unsafe, but actually what it was kind of interesting because they were driving in this very scenic, beautiful area with these kind of guys that would say, the few English words they knew were like curse words, so you hear just like fuck, 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 fuck all the time and shit and all that stuff. And even in Japanese, they were primarily using curse words because they were kind of rough around the collar. And then it goes up to Atsumi and Suroka and Sakura. That's what it is. Man, that's the name of what the cherry blossoms are, is the Sakura, and then the Hanami are the parties that happen below the Sakura. Man, that's terrible. Just awful. He goes up to Sakata, which is the city next to Suroka. Says they're basically just giant urban sprawl. Who cares? But north of there, he goes to the Buddha carvings, which he says are a lot like the Mount Rushmores of Japan, and much in the way that kind of a lot of art in the United States is very straight line. There is an impressionist and post-impressionist movement, but everything has to be kind of like, it's not, something isn't in relation to something else. It is its own thing, and even if it's an impressionistic thing, it is its own thing, and then the thing next to it is its own thing. Whereas he said that and that's kind of how Mount Rushmore is, very sort of realistic, somber men, one standing right next to the other. But these Buddha carvings that are north of Sakata are actually kind of free-flowing, where faces mold into other faces, and you kind of have to squint your eyes sometimes to see what exactly is going on with the carvings and stuff. And then he goes up to Akita, and he says he really likes Akita a lot because while it has a reputation as kind of a port town and kind of rough, and not just rough, but just kind of bland in the everyday port sense of it, a lot of cranes and stuff. He says, in away from the city, it's actually, I think, a castle town, even though it's a small castle town. And also just kind of uniquely Japanese, but not like overly so. I don't know how to describe it, but he did praise Akita a lot for being a surprise from what he expected, and one of the better towns he visited along this trip. He goes to Oshiro and Odati and Hirosaki, and once again going through the mountains, seeing some of the very early sakura blossoms fall to the ground. I think he also says in Akita, I'm going to backtrack a little bit. I think he says, I think it's in Akita, where, and you can substitute another city in because it's true wherever you go. He said that he was starting to run out of money, and so what he did is he actually went into a hostess bar, which is like, it's a bar where they have like karaoke, and it's very small, and it tends to be the waitress or the hostess, if you will, waits on one or two tables but gives them a lot of attention, and so she's kind of like flirting with them or whatever. I mean, they're not brothels by any means, but they're just kind of very individualized bars, if you will. Very small, one or two waitresses. They pay a lot of attention to the customers. But one of the advantages of going into a place like this, he knew, was that he would almost get co-opted, almost instantaneously get co-opted by Japanese businessmen who would, because he didn't want to get drunk on his own dime, buy him drinks. This is actually one of the more interesting stories of the book, so I'm going to kind of elaborate. And he said that initially he thought this was going to be a good idea, and it was, because he got some good drinks, and all he had to do was sing a few karaoke songs. I think he sang a few Elvis songs or whatever. They sang some Elvis songs, which he suffered through, but he got to have kind of a mildly good time on somebody else's time. But when you get co-opted by a Japanese business firm, or a bunch of Japanese businessmen from a Japanese business firm after hours, they're not going to let you go so easily. Now, not by force, but they're going to keep buying you drinks, and you're going to be expected to sing more songs, and the waitress is going to come by and ask if you need anything more, and you can't really say flat out that you want to leave, because that would be very embarrassing and be really a spoiled sport if you did that. So you had to kind of like initially enjoy this opportunity, but then suffer through the later hours to the point that he eventually did kind of, they all left that bar and went to another bar, and in between bars he actually kind of lost them. But by that point, didn't remember where his hotel was, got completely lost in the city, and actually had to go stay in a love hotel. Really what is known as you and your girlfriend are going to go rent a hotel for an hour or a night and go have sex hotel. But he had to go rent one of those because the regular hotel he was staying in, he couldn't find because he was so drunk from these Japanese businessmen. I don't know, it was a real funny story. So anyway, like I said, he goes north of Akita. Oh man, this is getting really long. He goes north of Akita up into Odate and Hirosaki. In Hirosaki, he says it's a very sort of ancient city. Once again, a castle town, but also he says the most Japanese of the Japanese cities that he visited. A lot of winding lanes. And, the Japanese know this and they really promote this. So, after that, he goes up into Aomori, A-O-M-O-R-I. Probably pronounced that wrong. Sound like Italian love. Aomori, and crosses over into Hokkaido. Now, even though this is called the Hokkaido Highway Blues, like I said, it goes from cape to cape, pretty much. And then up in, he goes to Hakodate, which, in addition to Kobe and Kagoshima, which actually visits Kagoshima shortly before he goes to Cape Sata in the south, as those are the three big views or famous views in Japan where you can go up on a mountain and see a city sit below the mountain. So it's very nice. He goes eventually up to Sapporo, and what does he say in Sapporo? He said that he liked it a lot. It's a very neon lit city, and it just has definitely sort of more a Denver type vibe or a Albuquerque type vibe than a Tokyo type vibe. In that even though it's a city surrounded by open regions and straight lanes, started by the Americans. And he also says that he sees a lot more Russian influence in Hokkaido, not necessarily politically, but just interchange in ethnicities and like sailors coming from Russia, stuff like that, even merchants. And then he goes up along the coast, Ishikari, Rumai. Well, I won't go through all of them, but the one thing that struck me about this stretch of the western coast of Hokkaido compared to the rest of the country was how stark it was. It really felt like this was the land of rough waves, of pebbles, of grassland, but not warm grassland, kind of like cool, cold grassland. Sort of, yeah, like I said, like Denver or even up in like Calgary or something during the wintertime or during the springtime. That was just kind of very open plains-ish, very gray skies, gray towns, gray waves, everything's gray. And eventually he winds up at Cape Soya, which is the northern cape in Japan, but actually not the northernmost point, because Roshiri and Ruban Island on Ruban actually has a northern point, so he kind of tries to go to those islands and in a very kind of melancholy way ends his journey in failure when he can no longer there's a snowstorm. He makes it from Hokkaido to Roshiri, which is sort of the connector ferry island, but the next ferry to go to Ruban gets canceled because there's a big snowstorm, which obviously, well, maybe not obviously, but Hokkaido is very known for. So anyway, that was a really long synopsis of the way the book was, but what I didn't talk about, which was the major advantage of the book, was why this is important culturally, or why the specific style that he chose was important culturally, specifically hitchhiking. And I think that oftentimes in Japan we get lost, at least impressions from Westerners, get lost behind the idea of the Shinkansen, the trains, or the big parts of Tokyo, like Shibuya, or I don't know, Roppongi, like these big kind of agglomerations of things without really kind of taking the time back to understand the people more on a one-on-one basis. Like we see kind of this mass thing that comes out of Japan, but not really understanding people. And now when you make a train, or even worse, a plane flight, you might interact briefly with somebody. Matter of fact, you might be sitting next to them. But whether you're in Japan or in the United States, kind of the classic dichotomy, if you will, not dichotomy, what am I saying? The classic circumstance that's understood between both parties is that you might say one or two pleasantries, but you're not going to talk, you're not going to get to know each other, you're just going to sit on an airplane until you get to your arrival point, and then that's going to be it. Whereas when you hitchhike, there's very much a interactionatory vibe. And not only is there an interactionatory vibe, there's actually something that was described in the book. It has a Japanese name, but I can't remember what it is, but it's essentially the student-pupil relationship that in Japan, almost everyone has a student-pupil relationship, even among friends. Very few friends are on completely equal terms. Now, they respect one another, but there's always the one that's a little more domineering, has a little more knowledge, and there's always the one that's kind of more the receiver. And I think the genius of Will Ferguson in this book is that he allows the people that drive him to be the teacher. You know, that's very much a circumstance of hitchhiking. They have the car. They're the ones that set, even if you can say where you're going to go, they're kind of the ones that can say yes or no, or set the agenda, or whatever. So he gets very much culturally absorbed in what these people's lives are. And it really is pretty genius, and he really gets the full spectrum, like I said, from the salaryman to the rough and tumble, what we would call redneck, to the student, to the elderly kind of small businessman. I think that he even saw that there was like a swingers couple that tried to pick him up at some point, which I thought was really funny. Yeah, so he really gets a wide array of who the people of Japan are. Like I said, I could comment on each of the individual people that hitchhiked or that picked him up. Be they quiet, reserved, or outgoing, or whatever. The only thing they had in common was that they were willing to pick him up. But that would make this review really long. So what I'm going to do is just say, this, and the other thing is this, okay, this is getting really long, but this is not a overly didactic book. Sometimes I think in books about Japan can be way too kind of up their own butthole, if you will. I think that, this book has a lot of humor. He's a Canadian, so Canadian hitchhiking is probably going to have some, not to be Canadian nationalist, but it's probably going to have some humor in it, believe it or not. So it gets a good impression of the people. It gives a good history. It kind of covers almost the entire geography of Japan outside of the major cities. It's a great book. So I would recommend it. Will Ferguson, Hokkaido Highway Blues, Hitch-Hiking in Japan. Okay, I probably didn't do it complete justice because it is 400 pages, but it's a good book. Read it, you guys. I don't know if you can quite see that. Hokkaido Highway Blues. Okay, see you guys. Check out some more of my reviews. Bye.